Notice how every bone in Yorick's body has been perfectly preserved, just as every verse in Surah 33 of the Quran has been perfectly preserved, even though more than 200 verses are missing from that one chapter. Notice that none of Yorick's muscles are missing, just as no chapters of the Quran are missing, even though Muhammad's companion Abu Musa said that 2 chapters of the Quran were lost because Muslims were too lazy to recite them, and another 2 chapters were excluded because Muslims didn't realize they were supposed to be in the Quran. Notice that Yorick still has all of his internal organs, just as the Quran still has all of the passages that were lost forever when the only Muslims who had them memorized died in battle.
So David Wood there, desperately trying to attack Islam and thereby prove to himself and others the validity of his own faith. Imam Mansoor Clarke, thank you for joining us. Imam Mustafa Siddiqui, thank you for joining us. What do you think, Imam Mansoor Clarke, about this allegation?
It's an interesting allegation, and he said a couple of things in that small clip, so I want to get straight into answering them. He's made 3 main claims. One is about how 200 verses were lost from Surah Al-Ahzab, which is chapter 33. Secondly, about how 2 chapters of the Holy Quran were lost by companions. He specifically talks about the narrations of Abdullah bin Mas'ud regarding that. And finally, he talks about how some verses which were only known to a particular number of huffaz or memorizers of the Holy Quran, when they died, these verses of the Quran were lost, according to him.
So he's trying to prove the lack of cogency of the claim made by Muslims that the Quran is perfectly preserved.
Absolutely, and he's trying to take narrations from history to try to prove that. And well, I mean, it's very quick and very easy to go through them, and I think I'll just do that now so that people can understand that how easy it is to try to take these things out of context, but actually, when looking at them in a bit more detail, it's quite easy to understand what's going on. With his first allegation regarding the 200 verses being lost, there's a couple of narrations. 2 of them are weak narrations, one by Hazrat Aisha, the other by Hazrat Ubay ibn Ka'b. Both these narrations talk about the number of verses in that chapter. These are weak narrations. One is by Ibn al-Luhayya, the other is by Abdullah ibn Shurayk al-Amiri. And if we look at these online and look up the chain of narrators and see how these narrators are viewed, we see these as weak ahadith, and weak narrations.
So they were not accepted by the compilers of the hadith as
authentic.
Good narrations or chains of narration.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The third and the only kind of one which we want to look at, it's just seen and recognized as acceptable and authentic, is a narration narrated by Ubay ibn Ka'b, who says that Surah Al-Ahzab was as long as Surah Al-Baqarah, or even longer. This is indeed an authentic narration with a sound chain of narration as well. But actually, when we look at this narration, it doesn't say the same thing that David Wood is saying at all. It simply says the very logical point that Surah Al-Ahzab and Surah Al-Baqarah at one point in time were the same length. Now, we understand very, very quickly, by a very basic understanding of revelation in Islam and the theology of Islam, that various verses of chapters were revealed at various times. And whole chapters were not necessarily revealed at one time, rather they might be revealed piecemeal over a longer amount of time. So too was the case of Surah Baqarah, which at one point in time indeed might have been the length of Surah Ahzab, which is around 70 or 75 verses approximately at that length. And as Surah Baqarah was at that length at that time, when Ubay ibn Ka'b said that now they are the same length, he was absolutely right. After that, however, Surah Baqarah was of course revealed over a period of around 10 years. So Surah Baqarah increased. So it wasn't that Surah Ahzab had verses taken out from it, rather that Surah Baqarah increased in length. So it's a very easy thing to understand.
Right. Okay. That's quite a base mistake really to make, isn't it?
Absolutely, especially for somebody who's there to critique Islam. It seems that he hasn't done his homework.
The channel is called Defend Christianity, Critique Islam. It's a big claim.
It's a big claim, and obviously one where he's fallen at the first hurdle. The second example that he gives is talking about how certain chapters were not included in the Quran that we see today. And he gives particularly, he said the name of the companion wrong, but I think he meant Hazrat Abdullah bin Mas'ud and the manuscript that he had. And he basically collected together certain chapters of the Holy Quran which he held personally before the standardization of the Holy Quran was instructed. And the 3 surahs that he talks about are the two quls, so the Qul A'udhu bi Rabbin Nas and Qul A'udhu bi Rabbil Falaq, which are near the end of the Quran, and the opening chapter of the Holy Quran, Surah Fatiha. And Hazrat Abdullah bin Mas'ud regarded these as prayers. They were quite short and they were often recited. And he said they're not chapters of the Holy Quran. Now, the important point to note here is that Hazrat Abdullah bin Mas'ud was only a companion of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Peace and blessings of God be upon him. He was not the Prophet. And so he is fallible and can make mistakes. But importantly, he never pushed or enforced this opinion of his upon the Holy Prophet or the other Muslims. In fact, when another individual went and asked the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, he asked them as to whether these two quls, the two qul surahs and Surah Fatiha, were a part of the Holy Quran. The Holy Prophet very easily stated, yes, they are. They're not separate of the Holy Quran, they're part of it.
Right.
So again, a very, very easy point to make, a very kind of
David Wood
base allegation.
Oh, right. So David Wood brought that up as to try to provide evidence for the idea that that there are things missing from the Quran, but the narrations themselves are weak, and the one which isn't weak obviously means the inverse of what he actually thinks it means. Has he provided any evidence, any actual evidence for his claims at all?
Not at all. The evidence that he's provided are those pieces of evidence which, actually, if you spend 2 or 3 minutes looking at, they quite evidently tell you the opposite story. It's very easy to leave out chains of narrations when you feel like it, or bring about points that you know actually mean the opposite. But simply put them on a video and you know the majority of people aren't going to sit down and actually look at what you're saying. As I've said repeatedly, especially to people like this, unfortunately, the lies get halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. And I think he's taking full advantage of that.
I think David was absolutely taking advantage of the fact that many people watching, either Muslims who are weakening in their faith or struggling, or Christians who want a bolstering of their faith, aren't actually going to look into the actual facts and into the narrations that are mentioned.
And I mean, critiquing Islam is very different to let's throw random baseless allegations at Islam, because they're very easy battered away. But if you actually do some basic research, I think maybe you can come with some sort of real allegations. The third point, this is the last part that I want to pick out from this, is where David talks about how there was a group of memorizers of the Holy Quran, Huffaz they're called, who had learned verses from the Holy Quran and in a specific battle had died. And as a result, took these verses with them to the grave, as it were. And so he's trying to make out that there was this lovely portion of the Quran which was lost, and therefore there was no God's plan behind its preservation, etc. Actually, this was the Battle of Yamama, and he's right in as much as that many Huffaz died, many memorizers of the Quran died in that war. But actually, if you look at the memorizers of the Holy Quran that were around at the time, there was actually an abundance of memorizers who were alive both before the Battle of Yamama, who actually learned the Quran during the time of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, and were also alive afterwards. I'll give you a couple of names: Abdullah bin Umar, Ubay bin Ka'b, Abu Ayyub Ansari, Ubadah bin Samit, Maz bin Jabal, Abu Darda. But also, this is where it gets a little bit darker, because the narration that he uses, if anyone wants to pull the narration out and actually look at it, it's very easy to see this is not a sound narration. The narration is taken from the book of Ibn Abi Dawud. And at first glance you think, oh, Abu Dawud. This is that famous narrator of one of the Sihah Sitta, the most authentic books of Hadith. But actually no, this is his son. Now this is not to say that this man is of ill repute. It's just simply to say that this is not the same kind of awe-inspiring name that we have at the beginning, which you think, oh gosh, if he's said
scholarship is not by inheritance.
Right. Now, the narration that he talks about is narrated by a man called Zuhri. He's the reporter. Zuhri, does not mention the fact that he was an eyewitness himself, nor does he reference his source, nor does he reference where he heard the information from. And in fact, what he says is clearly in contradiction to many other authentic sources of hadith, which say that although Huffaz did die, not a single ayah or verse of the Holy Quran was lost. So, in conclusion of all this, these 3 examples, I'm sure he's got many others, they are easily refuted simply by understanding the fact that if he's using the narrations and the hadiths of history in Islam to prove it, if you spend a minute to actually look at those same narrations and look at the logic behind it, the allegations very quickly fall apart, and you'll realize that the verses and the chapters that were included and revealed to the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, are the very same chapters and verses that we read in the Holy Quran across the world today.
Suspicion is a very mean replacement for real belief and faith. So, okay, let's move on to the next allegation that David Wood makes.
Notice that these two perfectly preserved Yoriks are completely identical in every way, just as all Quran manuscripts are completely identical right down to the letter, even though there are tens of thousands of differences in different Arabic versions of the Quran.
Again, David Wood leveling some allegations that there are tens of thousands of different variations of the Quran. Imam Mustafa Siddiqui, please enlighten David Wood and his viewership on the reality of this issue.
We're going to come in due course to the Bible and the New Testament, which is unfortunately a miserable failure in comparison to the Quran, because it's important to put this in context because of the fact that his channel is named Defend Christianity, Critique Islam. So we'll come to that. As for this itself and the idea of there being differences in the Holy Quran, there's another Christian, I think Jay Smith, making a big meal of the idea that, did you know there are this many Qurans and this is the secret thing that Muslims, silver bullet. And the thing is, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself said that when he was received the revelation of the Quran, he said that Gabriel recited the Quran to me in one way. Then I requested him to read it in another way and continued asking him to read it in other ways until he recited it. And he recited it in several ways until he ultimately recited it in 7 different ways. And that was by God's will. That wasn't just some kind of coincidence, because God said, because the Prophet peace be upon him said when 2 companions came to him, one of them, the second Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, said he heard another companion reading a verse in a different way to that which he'd been taught. So he went to the Prophet with that man, peace be upon him, and said, this man's reciting a verse in a way that was different to the way that you taught me. The Prophet asked him to read the verse, and then the other companion to read the verse, and he told them, it was sent down like this, and it was sent like that. And he said, in summary, this Quran was sent down in 7 different ways, so recite from it whatever is easy for you. These things, there's a couple of things here. These 7 modes of recitation, which are directly referenced by the Prophet, peace be upon him, in this saying and elsewhere, are called ahruf. Why do they exist? No, it's a matter of interpretation exactly what these ahruf are. One thing that they include by the consensus of all Muslim scholars is that they cover various dialects. Because if we look now at English, if we didn't have media and the news and widespread mass-printed written English, if we didn't have the contact we have, for example, like, I don't know, the Deep South in America, for example, or African-American English, our English, and then like Irish or Scottish English, if we didn't, it's already difficult for us often to understand what they're saying because some of the thickest accents. If we didn't have the commonality of written English and TV, you can imagine how difficult it would be for someone from the Deep South to understand someone from Ireland, for example, or me or something. These modes of recitation exist because obviously now the dialect of the Quran, the dialect of Arabic the Prophet spoke, is now internationally recognized as classical modern standard Arabic. At the time, it was just the dialect of one town in Mecca in Arabia. God deliberately, as part of his plan, revealed this Quran in 7 different ways to accommodate the language and the dialect of the tribes surrounding Mecca, because that unit of people, that nation, would eventually become the transmitters and the bearers of the Quran, who would then pass it on geographically around the world and then later throughout the future generations.
I think it's also important to note here that we're talking about ahruf and we're talking about the different ways of reciting the Quran. We're not talking about huge whole verses. We're talking about singular small words which mean exactly the same thing in both narrations.
That's the point. There's a couple of differences. Sometimes it's diacritical marks. Sometimes it's a word. Sometimes it's a way of saying the word. There's different differences. The priority here is that there is absolutely no contradiction in any of these things. That's the difference. And then when we later on talk in this episode about the differences between the King James Bible and the New American Standard Version and this version and that version, then you see the difference, and then you kind of, through contrast with the Bible, understand the value of the preservation of the Quran.
So, in essence, it would seem that David Wood and other detractors of the Quran or detractors against Islam are trying to take issues of dialect and pronunciation that were essentially like issues of different accents in different regions, as we have anywhere in the world, and trying to essentially say that there were entirely different and contradictory meanings. Now, one thing that I think is interesting for us, important for us to note, is surely the Arab speakers of that time, from different parts of Mecca and Medina and different parts of, the Arabian Peninsula, which was very vast, had lots of different dialects. If they had truly, as the Christians claim, contradicting meanings in the different dialectical versions of the Quran, then that would become very, very clear. And in fact, given the amount of conflict that erupted after the death of the Holy Prophet, that would have been a key part of the conflict. But the mere fact that that didn't happen actually demonstrates that it is a matter of, that they all understood that it was a matter of pronunciation.
Absolutely.
And when the Caliph, Hazrat Usman, may Allah be pleased with him, actually standardized the pronunciation, what he did was he prevented the further digression of later versions as a result of differences in pronunciation, which is what happens in language.
Absolutely.
So the Christians are trying to make out that differences in pronunciation were actually differences in meaning, whereas they aren't. And never were. And
also the differences in pronunciation, again, just so that people don't think at home that we are avoiding the question. The pronunciation is one element of it. There is also certain words that mean exactly the same thing, but in different areas of Arabia, where a word would not be in use in one area of Arabia. And so by using that one word, they simply wouldn't understand what's being said.
Right.
And so explain to them that this is the original version of the Quran, with this is the original words, this word means this. And they're like, oh, right, okay. And when they're reciting it, they recite it with that word to understand to their local people what that's supposed to be saying.
Right.
That's not meant, however, to say that this standardized version of the Quran was wrong or that it's right. Simply, it is a means for everyone to understand what is being said. It was a matter
of time, and by the time, after the rapid expansion of geographically the Islamic Empire during the Caliphate of the second Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, that brought the Arabic of the Quran to nations of people who didn't speak Arabic. And so you had, and later on we'll mention the fact that David Wood says that the third Caliph Uthman, may Allah be pleased with him, burnt the Quran to hide the fact that there were these differences. It reminds me of a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because his getting rid of the other copies and standardizing it was him preempting and dealing with this thing. But him dealing with it, according to David Wood, is a sign of the fact that he did it to hide it.
Right. So in essence, the suspicion with David Wood and DCCI seems to have come first, and the search for evidence seems to have come later.
As is a common theme, it seems.
Right. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for a very clear elucidation. Let's move on to the next part.
You don't know what Yorick looked like the day he was born? Just as Muslims don't have a copy of the Quran from the time of Muhammad. Uthman burned all of the early copies of the Quran to cover up the differences. So we have no way of knowing how different today's Quran is from the original Quran, just as we have no way of knowing how different Yorick is from the day he was born.
David Wood essentially, he's essentially insinuating that that the Quran we have shouldn't be looked at, and the Quran that he claims no longer exists is the thing that we really should.
That was the real Quran.
That was the real Quran, without providing any evidence. So, Imam Mansoor Clarke, please.
It's preposterous, actually, because how do you ascertain the originality of anything or the authenticity of anything if the basis of finding out if this was original like that or not is that you had to be there at that point in time? Let's get rid of the whole of history then. What's archaeology? We don't know if this bone was actually existing. How do we know what the dinosaurs actually were like? We can't tell because this bone doesn't look like it did, 15, I don't know, I'm not going to guess the millions of years, but anyway, right, millions of years ago. It's preposterous. And for someone purporting to be an academic to critique Islam, to make that kind of allegation is simply lazy. Again, a word that he used. But anyway, the way that we can ascertain whether something is as close to its original form as possible is to try to find the very most earliest version of it and to compare it to what we actually have in our hands now. And I know we'll talk about the Birmingham Quran. That sounds very different, but the manuscript of the Quran found in Birmingham University. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Held in Birmingham University.
Well, held in Birmingham University, right. But the easiest way of us doing this is to try to find, again, in two forms. One, a written version. the earliest written version that we can find, compare it to today's. That's been done. I don't need to go into the details. Or we find the audio version, which is lovely. If we want to find if a book's been changed, we find the audio book today, and we cross-reference them both. And actually, with the Quran, we actually have audiobooks recorded in the hearts and the minds, the mouths of billions of Muslims throughout time, who from the very moment that it was revealed to today, just in this room, we have people who can recite parts of the Holy Quran, or indeed whole of the Holy Quran, by memory. And so when we compare all these together, we have a very, very interesting account of how from day one till day now, there is this constant stream of the same manuscript being handed down.
And can I just ask, just maybe for some of our viewers who don't understand that process, how exactly have Muslims maintained the oral tradition of the Quran, and how do they correct each other if a mistake arises in one of their memories?
Well, it's a really good point, actually, because I was thinking about this point the other day. The Quran is not a book to be opened on Sundays. The Quran is a book which is opened every day and remains open throughout the world. And one of the most fantastic things that God Almighty says in the Quran is, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun," that surely it is us that has revealed the Quran, and it is we that take its responsibility of looking after and keeping it intact. Now, one way in which this was done in a practical way was not only is the Holy Quran memorized by simply people sitting down and memorizing the whole text, but also including it into things like the law, including into things like in daily prayer. When you're standing up in congregational prayer with everyone there, you are reading portions of the Quran out loud. And there is the tradition that when one makes a mistake, someone behind him from the followers will correct him, at which point he corrects himself and carries on.
So they're essentially always continuously cross-checking their memory with each other.
Yeah.
To prevent...
such an extent that, God forbid, if all of the copies of the Quran today were to be burned, God forbid, within a day or within a matter of hours, the entire Quran would be able to be rewritten in exactly the same form as it was revealed all those years ago to the Prophet Muhammad.
Because there are many thousands of memorizers
which
of the Quran around the world.
Which other book can claim that to happen? The Bible sure can't.
No.
The Bible, whilst other copies of the Bible were in existence, wasn't able to copy across the meaning, let alone the meaning, but even the text itself to another copy. So it's something which is quite easily answered. Also, I mean, of course, during that time, there wasn't just people who were learning the Quran later on after the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him. These were people at that time, before him, were writing it down and learning it there and then. Every verse that came across. In fact, if you look at the number of days across which it was revealed, the Holy Quran, and the number of verses, in fact, whole days would go by where only a part of a verse was revealed. And so you had a whole day to memorize that part of the verse and then recite it in the prayers and recite it in your laws, to teach it to your children, to teach it to your families. And so you had this wonderful situation where from then till now, you have not only a written manuscript where you can go back to and cross-check, you also have the audio book of the Holy Quran. So when you have all of this for one book, and then you have the evident interpolations and changes in the Bible. I mean, glass houses and stones anyone? So, I mean, like, it's, yeah, I think I've said enough on that.
Okay, thank you very much.
I would actually like to make another point.
Okay, go ahead.
With that. I've said enough, but
No,
the fact is that, I mean, I did some looking, because I think, you know, Muslims are obviously going to say that the Holy Quran is well preserved. This isn't just something said by Muslims. In fact, when we look at, say, for example, the famous British historian Bosworth Smith in his book Muhammad and Mohammedism, again, a book which I'm sure David Wood has read if he purports to be someone who's critiquing Islam, as he says himself. In the Quran, it's a quote, "In the Quran we have beyond all reasonable doubt the exact words of Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, without subtraction and without addition." Now, he says Muhammad because, of course, this isn't a Muslim speaking, so he would not ascribe this to God. But the fact that he says these are the exact words of Muhammad, he's a historian, he then is basically giving his own testimony to the fact that it is a continuous chain of relation. Very similar is said by the British scholar Lane Poole in Selection from the Quran again, who says that there is no doubt as to its genuineness. I mean, we keep going on. I don't want to keep on taking all this stream, but the Caliph, the Caliph Usman as well. We talked about the burning of the Qurans, and I think perhaps we'll come on to that a little bit later as well, because it's a very important point for us to get across.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that elucidation there. And just, I think, for a final clip now, the last part of David Wood's allegation in this video.
Yorick has been perfectly preserved because I say that he's been perfectly preserved. Just as the Quran has been perfectly preserved because the compulsive liars we call Muslim scholars say that the Quran has been perfectly preserved.
So David Wood continuing there to make some allegations. I noticed that maybe earlier on, or maybe possibly in that clip, he made the allegation that Hazrat Usman, may Allah be pleased with him, burned all the Qurans, and Imam Mustafa Siddiqui, you did actually address that, in passing. But maybe we should sit on it for a while and actually focus on it. So David Wood is saying that the reason, or he's insinuating that the reason that Hazrat Usman, may Allah be pleased with him, burned all the Qurans is to hide something terrible from the world. Again, playing a little bit of a magic trick there, telling the world not to look at the actual Quran, but that there was something else which he can't provide any evidence for, that is very scary, and that means that they should never look at Islam, in essence. But what would we actually say to that allegation? Why were the Qurans burned, and what?
I think the first thing to mention, without a doubt, is that the Prophet, as we mentioned before, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that God revealed the Quran in 7 ways. So this variation was necessary at the beginning because of what we discussed about the difference of dialects in a time when there wasn't even standardized Arabic like we have standardized languages now.
That's a very important point.
So we have that, of course. So when at the very point of the inception of the Quran, God revealed it to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with explicit instructions that it will be revealed in 7 ways, and he taught these different 7 ways to his companions, and then when his companions differed about how to pronounce a particular word or verse, he told them that you're reading it right because these are the Quran was read in 7 ways, and you recite whichever one's easy for you.
Yes. Because they were of different regions of Arabia, and they had different dialects.
Naturally, right. Yes, absolutely. So
I think the important point here, of course, is also the fact that when people say this allegation against Hazrat Usman, the third caliph, they almost make it out as if there was this, God forbid, this tyrannical leader who had decided that, right, I have got to make the biggest cover-up in history and delete the word of God and present this completely fabricated manuscript for everyone to believe in. But it's quite simply not the case.
So what actually happened?
So in actuality, of course, we have Hazrat Usman, the third caliph, who's a very pious man, who's known throughout history as a very pious man, who led a whole religion of believers who followed his leadership. And when he expressed the need for this to take place, there wasn't a hue and a cry. There wasn't, oh no, we want to keep hold of our... It was an understood problem that was faced. I'll explain why I'm going into this in a bit now. When we look at the allegation made at Hazrat Usman, we actually have to go back to the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings of God be upon him's time. At his time, the Holy Quran was not only all revealed, but it was also memorized and written down. People seem to forget this fact. The Quran was written down in the time of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him. Now, after that stage, of course, we cannot create a written manuscript at the time of the Prophet because the verses continue to be revealed until his death.
Sorry, just to point that. It wasn't just written down. The Prophet had appointed Kutab al-Wahi, the scribes of revelation, 15 companions at least, as far as names are mentioned in the traditions. And I remember reading narrations of the Prophet where he told them, even though he couldn't read, like, I can recognize letters from other languages without knowing how to read them. He told them to what the Arabic equivalent is of dot the I's and cross the T's.
To write it perfectly.
Yes, and then he not only would he tell them to write them down, he'd also encourage them to memorize these verses.
Okay.
And so to give you a brief timeline, so these people wrote the revelation down. They kept the Quran.
So it was written down and memorized, extensively by many people.
Yes, immediately.
There were 10,000 companions with the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, at the conquest of Makkah.
Exactly.
Right, 10,000 companions with him. Okay, and after that, Islam spread rapidly through Arabia, and there were countless memorizers of the Quran and scribes and written copies. But those different people from different dialects would pronounce words and say words in their own regional manner. Now, that was the problem that the third caliph, Hazrat Usman, when Islam had become this unifying force and essentially created a centralized state, now needed a standardized version of what they all understood, but what to the outside world would become too complex if there were different dialects.
This actually roots back to Hazrat Abu Bakr's time.
Right.
So this is what many people forget this. The first caliph, Hazrat Abu Bakr, he is actually the one who unified the Quran. He ordered for it to be...
He first compiled
He ordered for all the different various pieces of the Quran to be compiled into one volume. So they actually had this one volume standardized Quran in the time of the Hazrat Abu Bakr. Now, after that, when we have Hazrat Umar, when we have the expansion of Islam, that is the time in which we have the spread of Islam, the spread of the knowledge of the Quran. Now, we're not talking about control print 1,000 copies, 10,000 copies. We're not talking about printing presses. We're talking about the handwritten narrations of the Quran, where one person, if he wishes to give the Quran to somebody else, he would have to narrate the whole Quran and he would write it down. Now, while Islam was spreading, physical copies of the Quran were not spreading as quickly. And so people were writing down according to what they were hearing. So of course you have problems in people writing with writing it down. You have problems in people pronouncing certain words in different ways according to what they remembered. You have problems in the various different small variations of the ahruf and the qiraat that we talked about. So all of these problems, which were foreseen, of course, before by the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, they were existing at the time. And so at that moment in time, there is a need for Hazrat Usman to standardize the Holy Quran. And what he does is not just one man thinks, I want this to be in the Quran. Very, very stringent conditions were laid down where each verse would have to be corroborated both by memory and also by a written reference.
Right.
And so when so much effort was put into standardizing this Quran, which we know now to be perfect, and in the dialect and in the way of pronunciation of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, the original way in which it was revealed, then all of the other versions partially written on a piece of leather here or partially written on a piece of parchment over there, those were to be disposed of. Now, when we look at burning things in today's day and age, it's seen as almost sacrilegious. Burning of the parchments of the Quran, these incomplete or various different narrations, that was the most respectable way to
this day, when there's a piece of paper with God's name on it, we burn it. And obviously when we got like recycling, like I've got a separate Hampshire recycling green and a black bin. But in those days, burning was what you did. There wasn't any recycling over there.
And so there's not some big cover-up story. And there wasn't. So from we have the narrations of William Tyndale, where his translations of the Bible were seized and bishops were buying them in the 1500s, where they were bought and they were burned en masse. This is not the same thing. This is the authority of Islam, along with the consensus of all of the senior companions who were from the time of the Prophet Muhammad.
Many of whom, in fact, almost all of whom were memorizers
of the Holy Quran. They sat together, they made sure that this one standardized manuscript contains all of the verses in a proper way, according to how they were supposed to be recited, standardized it, and got rid of all of the other versions, and then sent that out to all of the countries saying, this is the copy that you use. Yeah. Where is the problem in that?
Also, we've gone a lot into the third caliph's burning of the Quran, but looking at the general of copies of the Quran, additional copies of the Quran, generally looking at a holistic view of the preservation of the Quran, it's important to remember that when, after the passing of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the first caliph got the companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Zayd bin Thabit, to first compile the Quran, he did that by getting all the manuscripts, comparing them to the people who had memorized it. And this isn't memorizing like memorizing now. The Arabs, their primary form of transmission was memorization, because most of them couldn't read. And those who could read had been appointed as scribes. So you had oral and written.
So both at the time
together.
Right. So both at the time of Hazrat Zayd bin Thabit and also at the time of Hazrat Usman, may Allah be pleased with them, they compiled what became the standardized version of the Holy Quran by cross-referencing both the consensus of all of the memorizers present, and also needing a written reference from an original manuscript from the time of the Holy Prophet's life to corroborate that. How then can people like David Wood claim that there was some massive cover-up when everybody knows that this is how it was done? And the reason it was done was actually to prevent the very thing that David Wood is claiming happened.
And also the other thing, this allegation of cover-up, we're sitting here talking about the Ahruf, we're talking about the Qiraat, because it is something which has been passed down in Islam. We know that. We talk about the different Qiraat because of the fact that it's a beautiful way of God explaining the certain words within the Quran by different
Messiah
meanings.
has used in places other renditions of the Quran, these variations, to provide additional light and to explain verses and words from a different angle on the basis of these.
Right, so it's not a cover-up. It's not, oh, we're really scared of this coming out. It's there. It was done for a purpose and has come through in our historical narrations to this day because it was something that was planned by God and was informed to the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him.
Just to contextualize, we have to look at the Bible. I cannot miss the fact.
Please.
When you look at the Bible, that for example, if you look at memorization, okay, I memorized like a chapter of the Quran when I was younger, and another 10th a few years ago. And my uncle and one of my close friends was on the phone today, and loads of my friends from the seminary. All these people have memorized the entire Quran. I don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong. I've never heard of like even the great like the most senior priests having memorized parts of the Quran.
Parts of the Bible.
The Bible, sorry, of course. So,
or let alone all of the Bible.
Yes,
all of the Bible.
So there's that,
right?
And there's also the fact that if you look at like corruption preservation, when the Bible itself, the New Testament, was written by several different people, many years afterwards, of what they remember of the time of Jesus.
300 years later.
Yes,
it's compiled.
The thing with the Bible is
So none of them were eyewitnesses.
Definitely.
So when we go into this, oh well, that person, this narrator of a hadith related from him, said this.
This is
at least
invalid,
we
this is
have,
weak, this
at
is
least we
strong.
have these chains of narration available. When we look
Well,
at
that's the hadith.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where is the chain of narration? These people who we don't even know if they existed or not.
The ahadith is secondary to the Quran, right? The Quran, we know, has a perfect chain of preservation because we know how the original scribes, Hazrat Zayd bin Thabit and then Hazrat Usman, the Caliph, compiled it. And from that very time, from the time of Hazrat Usman to today, we can compare the manuscript from then to today, and it's identical. The Birmingham manuscript is an example. And the hadith is secondary to that. And even with the hadith, we have chains of narration going back dozens of narrators with an assessment of their lives and whether they had ever told a lie. The Bible can't even reach the level of the hadith. We don't know who any of the narrators are. We don't know who any of the compilers are. The scholars of the Bible have arguments about who wrote entire different chapters.
Should this, like he says, one chapter 33 has lost 200 verses apparently out of what, tens of thousands of verses of the Quran. You have how many books of the New Testament? Like 60 books of the New Testament, of which 5 were arbitrarily chosen, and 55 out of 60 books, which is like over 80% of the Bible, was just discarded.
Were just discarded and made apocryphal. And actually many of the doctrines in those so-called apocryphal books outright contradict the main doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. So the actual allegation that he's making against Islam is actually present in Christianity, but it's not present in Islam.
So I would like to very easily pose a question to David Wood, saying that, do you genuinely believe that the Bible is the word of God and is
The revealed word of
a revealed word of God and is void and devoid of any discrepancies and interpolations and contradictions? Do you believe that? Because if you do, you are naive. And if you don't, then how can you level allegations against Islam and the Quran when quite clearly, if these were the best allegations you could come up with, which we've swatted away very, very easily with a simple search and a simple reading of history, then what is it that you are trying to achieve? In reality, if you spent less time looking for props and more time reading the books, then maybe his allegations would mean something.
And that's a wonderful way to close up the refutation of these rather weak allegations. I think in the end it becomes quite clear that to those seeking a clear, consistent, open, revealed word of God, the Holy Quran is that book. Muslims should feel happy and should take heed, and Christians are welcome to read the Quran and to find the guidance therein. Thank you very much, both Imams, again, for a wonderful elucidation of the truth. Inshallah, everybody, thank you. We will be seeing you hopefully next week for another True Islam UK live show. And hopefully we'll have a little bit more time to take live questions, live callers. Please send things in via social media as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Peace be upon you.